Thank you. Can you hear me? The microphones are working great. Well, I like to always have a sense of who I'm talking to and why you're here. And I did hear someone on the way in say, well, I was married to a history professor for years and years. So I'm curious, do we have any history professors or social studies teachers? Great. And what do you do?
High school history.
High school history, fantastic. Yeah.
I've taught community college.
Great, yeah. Well, the talk I'm going to give is a very sort of personal sense of my own inquiry about what we learn when we learn history. And I started being very, very interested in this question when I went to graduate school, and I took a history methods course from a very, very prominent historian. His name is Bernard Bailyn, and he's considered really the father of American colonial history. And he loved intellectual puzzles. He loved every week he would give us this sort of wonderfully intricate assignment, and we'd have to figure out what it was that he was thinking. And one week, I think it was our very first paper, he gave us a paper in which he said, now I want you to tell me, what is the use of history? And I thought, you know, it's never occurred to me. I've never asked that question. Here I've interned at the Vermont Historical Society. I've signed up for a PhD in American history. And I've never thought about what are the uses of history. And so I talked with other professors and I talked with my classmates, and we all wrote the paper. And my classmates then went on to really, to get very much interested in their own areas of interest. But for me, I thought, that question really persisted. What's the point? What are we doing here? What are the uses of history? And as I've begun to teach, particularly, I've become more and more interested in that. So that's what I want to talk about this evening. I'm not going to talk about 5 foreign policy lessons. I think that there certainly is plenty that we can learn from history that can inform economic decision-making, political decision-making. Whether or not it's possible to win a war in Afghanistan might be one question. But I don't want to, but that's not what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on much more on these more sort of these habits of mind, these intellectual skills and habits of mind that I find that we learn when we learn history. Now, I've asked, in preparation for this talk, when I was sort of conceiving it, I went around to a number of my historian friends and I said, well, what do we learn when we learn history? And I got this wide range of answers. And so I organized a talk at the New England Historical Association. I was the chair of a panel, and I posed this question to each of the panelists. And this one woman got up and she stood in the middle of the room and she sang this revolutionary song. And she said, when I teach history, I teach music. And then this other woman was a fabulous high school history teacher, and she showed us a video of her honor students, the ones who are sort of constantly trying to get into Ivy League colleges and wondering about what to study on the test. And she made them fill their backpacks full of stones and put on, what are they called, the snorkels, and crawl across a field as a way to simulate what it was like for a soldier in World War I. And then a third person gave us this very sort of detailed and wonderful syllabus in which she had articulated all these intellectual skills. And I loved it because it was such a wide variety, even of approach. How do you approach that question? And there were so many different ways even to approach that question. So what I want to do tonight is in fact quite personal. I do think that the study of history has some real constants and it has some real value. And I've articulated some of these for myself, and I hope to have a pretty lively discussion in the question and answer period. So I've organized the talk into 2 parts. Let's see. Uh-oh. I can find them. First is intellectual skills. By this I mean learned abilities, something you can teach. Analyzing primary sources, evaluating sources, and categorizing or finding patterns. The second part is habits of mind, ways of approaching an issue. And there I'm going to talk about historical imagination, skepticism, and thinking from multiple perspectives. So I want to start by looking at those intellectual skills. Oops. And I'm going to emphasize that this comes from my own perspective, which is as someone who has taught college level and master's level students, as someone who writes history, and as someone who comes from a very, very academic context. But other people are going to have other answers to these questions. Analyzing primary sources. One of the things that a historian does is take an object or a written record and figure out what it is and why it's important, what it can tell us about the ways that people have lived and what they've valued. Oftentimes it's a written record. That's many things that we're all quite conversant in. It could be a collection of canning jars. It could be a bullet. It could be an old bear trap. And I thought we'd go through that process here by using this object. How do you approach an object like this? Well, first of all, does anyone know what it is? Apple corer. Okay, great. You should see high school students. And one of the things that this is not only an apple corer, it is a peeler and a slicer in addition. We have one of these at home, and they are, yeah, I find them wonderfully intricate. So with this machine, an experienced cook could core, pare, and slice an apple in less than 3 seconds. And as you can imagine, apples were a real winter staple. And they were oftentimes stored in barrels, but we all know that saying, one bad apple. And so if you didn't have to store your apples in barrels, if you could in fact dry them, then you were much better off because you could be much more assured of your ability to keep them. So many, in the 18th and 19th centuries, apples were often peeled and cored and sliced and hung over the hearth on linen thread as a way to dry them. Who would use it? That's another historical question. And this was used oftentimes by individual farm wives who were wanting to store apples for the winter. It was used on an individual household level rather than in a kind of factory mass production setup. What symbols or markings does it contain? That's another question. This one, you can't really read it, but it says 1885 little star. And if you trace that, you'll find that it was patented, which is also an interesting piece of information. And the first apple parer was patented in 1803. And in the 19th century, guess how many patents there were for apple and potato peelers? Just a figure. 197. More. 500. 500. So that gives you a sense, and that's patents, you know. So what can it tell us about the world in which it was made? It tells us something about the economy of the times. The most successful patent was by a New Hampshire man named David Harvey Goodall, and he patented it in 1864. He called it the lightning apple parer. And he decided to ask a New York firm to market it because he thought that they would be better. And they took 2 years, and they sold 2,400 of them. And he said, there's much more of a market out there. And so he became a traveling salesman, and he sold 24,000 of them in a month. So that really tells you, something. There was a huge demand for these, and it shows a community in transition. This is a etching by Winslow Homer, 19th century artist. And it's titled Fall Games, the Apple Bee. We often know about quilting bees, but this in fact was an apple bee in which neighbors would get together to peel, slice, and dry apples. And after the apple corer was invented, there was no longer such a need for major community gatherings like this. And so there was this whole world that was kind of fading out with those 500 patents for the apple and potato peelers. The corer was also a part of a growing movement for technology in the home. And we don't necessarily think of it as technology when we see it now, compared to an iPhone. But there were any number of inventions like hand crank washing machines, potato washers, that were in fact technology that were brought into the home. And so you see a lot of production going on a household basis. So you can see just from taking one source and analyzing it, how much you can learn and how much of a world you can create. The second intellectual skill is evaluating sources. When I went around to my historian friends and say, okay, what do you learn when you learn history? Every single one of them mentioned this. The ability to take a look at, see who is talking and what their investment is in an issue, and see how that shapes their message. And I think that that's fairly intuitive. I think all of you know what I'm talking about when I say that. But I want to give you an example to really bring it home. When the early English colonists came over to the New World, many of them wrote accounts of their experiences, which were then published back home. And here are two gentlemen who each published books about the New World in the 17th century. And I want to compare what they each said about the landscape of Massachusetts. This is Thomas Morton. He was an Englishman and an adventurer who set up a colony called Marymount in what's now Massachusetts. Some of you may know of it through Nathaniel Hawthorne. And this is what he wrote. This is how he described it. The more I looked, the more I liked it. And when I had seriously considered the beauty of the place with all her fair endowments, I did not think that in all the known world it could be paralleled. For so many goodly groves of trees, dainty, fine, round, rising hillocks, delicate, fair, large plains, sweet crystal fountains, and clear running streams. Contained within the volume of the land are fowls in abundance, fish in multitude, and I discovered besides millions of turtle doves on the green boughs, which sat pecking of the full, ripe, pleasant grapes that were supported by the lusty trees, whose fruitful load did cause the arms to bend, which made the land to me seem paradise. It's a pretty extraordinary passage. And you can hear his delight in the natural resources, you know, the trees, the streams, the birds, the fish, the grapes. And he, in fact, called his book New English Canaan, with Canaan being the promised land. The other person whose account we'll look at is William Bradford, who wrote Of Plymouth Plantation, which was a history of the Pilgrims. And here is his description of the Pilgrims' encounter with the countryside, just miles away. They had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. The savage barbarians, when they met with them, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men? For summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. Could not be more different. So what's the difference? Now, when I asked this question, when I gave this talk before, someone said, well, one was summer and one was winter. And I absolutely have to agree that that's true. But why would they be so different? Yeah.
I think if Morton had founded a colony, presumably he was writing to get people back home to go. Sounds like Canaan to me. Whereas Bradford, I'm assuming, for reasons of his own, was wishing to enhance the bravery and
Yes.
the courage of those original, maybe the saintliness of those original pilgrims.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Morton had he had this real financial motive. He was trying. His entire book was essentially an volumes long mass advertisement for people to come and join him at Marymount. Bradford was actually, he was writing as an older man. He had been the governor of Plymouth Plantation, and Massachusetts Bay Colony had then come and eclipsed them. Arrived 10 years later and rapidly eclipsed Plymouth Plantation. And so Morton was really struggling, or Bradford was really struggling to make sense of that. And the way he describes it, the language is really almost biblical, isn't it? And it really emphasizes the bravery and the courage and the struggles. The wilderness quality. I mean, even that word is biblical. So as a historian, you learn exactly that, to evaluate the sources and to see what motives may exist, whether they're financial or emotional or other behind a given piece. The third intellectual skill is categorizing. And by this I mean taking all the stories and facts from your sources and organizing them into categories. If you think about history as sort of potentially everything that's happened up until this moment, trying to discern which of those elements is important, how you're going to talk about, how you're going to structure a narrative. One of the most interesting people to write on this is a historian named Edward Hallett Carr, and he gave a series of lectures at the University of Cambridge in England, which he then published as a book. It's called What is History? It was published in 1961. And he made a distinction between the facts of the past, which is everything that's ever happened, including both the facts that historians think are important and those that they don't, and then historical facts. And those, he said, those are the facts that historians have deemed important. So we said if you look at all the people, millions and millions of people have crossed the Rubicon, but historians only talk about one of those crossings, that of Julius Caesar. And so that then becomes a historical fact. And so it's very interesting as a historian, you face this continual process of trying to decide, which of these facts do I need to pull out and emphasize as a historical fact. And when I was writing my book on the American flag, the history of the American flag, I faced this process in a way that I had sort of learned about it conceptually in graduate school, but then when I came to write my own book, I faced it. And I want to kind of recreate that just very, very briefly here. There are thousands of stories about the flag, and I read all the material I could find, which was tremendous, until I got a sense of the field. And then I sat down and I identified patterns in the way that the flag was used and key moments. Here, just as a kind of a quick way, I'd like to do this with you. Here are a number of flags. The first is the Continental Colors, which is arguably the first American flag. People have an argument about that. In 1775, before the Stars and Stripes. This one is called the prisoner's flag. It was made by a revolutionary sailor who was held captive in a British prison, probably in 1778 or so. This is a nativist flag, anti-immigrant. Can you see that down below? And that was flown at an anti-immigrant parade in Philadelphia in 1844. You have an abolitionist flag, which was made by the followers of John Brown. And it has 20 stars instead of 35. Anyone want to venture a guess as to why?
He wasn't recognizing the slaves.
Yes, only the slaves that disallowed slavery. He said only those have the right to be in the Union. The flag that was flown at Fort Sumter and attacked by secessionists to begin the Civil War. The Bonnie Blue flag, which was very, very popular in the months around the succession. Jefferson Davis gave a speech on the floor of the Senate, and he said, "I wish I could take my star, Mississippi's star, and take it from the flag and take it back with me." And so kind of as a result of that speech, that flag became quite popular in the southern states. Here's the flag that was carried into battle by Pennsylvania troops, which was given to them by women who sewed it themselves from the town. And finally, the flag of the Confederacy. So that, it's kind of, here you have all these different flags, and they're sort of there, and you have to figure out what to do with them and how to organize them and how to categorize them. As you look at them, what kind of patterns do you see? What would be a possible way to organize them? Chronologically. Then you like a historian. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you could set them out. What is it? Eight chapters in a row, right? One about each flag. You could also do it by war. The flags are surrounding the Revolution, for example, and then the Civil War flags. And you can see even by the number of this, I did this on purpose, but that the flag became much, much more significant in the Civil War. And you could, potentially, if you're writing this book, you could divide the Civil War flags into those that are associated with battle and those that were associated with protest of some form, like the abolitionist flag and the Bonnie Blue flag. And so no matter those decisions about how you write or how you present something have these implicit assumptions about, they make an implicit argument about what's important and what the causality is. So categorization is a really, really important historical skill. And it's fun to become alert to it, especially as you read textbooks and you can see that categorization happening in a way that people can't necessarily first time around. I want to turn now to the habits of mind and talk about historical imagination. I personally would argue that this is one of the most powerful and important habits things that one learns as a historian. I often think of it as historical empathy, but essentially it's the ability to get out of your own skin and to try and understand the experience of another individual, as best we can. Obviously we can't ever really understand it, but to move out and to recapture as best you can the world around them and what's going on for them internally and externally. When I did my talks about the American flag, I would put this up, and people laughed a lot. It just sort of, the immediate reaction was humor. And you can kind of see why. Here you have these signs, race mixing is communism, stop the race mixing, March of the Antichrist, and they, they've got funny glasses, but I think, to me, that was a really interesting reaction, and I wanted to take a moment and to think about, I think it's really, really important to understand, not to laugh at these people, but to understand exactly what was going on, because they are not just sort of relics that we can shunt aside now. They represent a really, really important way of thinking about race that has dominated for quite a long time, certainly in the 20th century and before in American history. So this is where historical imagination comes in. This is a rally at an Arkansas State Capitol building in August 1959, and it's protesting the integration of Central High School in Little Rock. And Brown versus Board of Education had passed desegregating the schools in 1954. In 1957, the Little Rock nine black children went to Little Rock High School and integrated it. In 1958, the governor of Arkansas said, instead of having our schools integrated, I'm going to close them down. And so he closed the high school, and the teachers had to go to work every single day for the year, but the students didn't go. And so in 1959, the schools reopened as integrated schools. And these people are protesting that. So they are already, at this moment, on the losing side of history, and they know it. But I want to try and capture what they were thinking. And I'm going to read you a quote from the Executive Director of the Citizens Councils of America. Anyone know what the Citizens Councils were, white Citizens Councils? It's kind of the uptown Ku Klux Klan. They tended to be more upstanding citizens. So he read this. Ladies and gentlemen, if we allow integration to be forced upon us, if we allow the resulting destruction of our social order, we can expect no economic or cultural future whatsoever. What are the conditions which an arrogant federal government would foist upon us? Our city governments would be debauched by the Negro bloc vote. Black insolence would threaten women, and gangs of black toughs would threaten our children, as is happening in so many cities of the North today. We gladly grant the Negro his right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if he can be happy without exercising kinship with the white race or dragging us down to his level. But if he cannot find happiness except in amalgamation with the white race, let him look for another world in which to live. There is no room for both of us on this continent. Integration represents darkness, regimentation, totalitarianism, communism, and destruction. Segregation represents the freedom to choose one's associates, Americanism, state sovereignty, and the survival of the white race. I deliberately chose this passage because it is so hard, I think, for many of us to relate to. But what do you hear in that? What are his concerns? Fear.
Well, I just
Yeah.
have to think about Martin Luther King going to write that beautiful song that night. And he must have been, it must have been a very long time for him. And yet, he pulled everything together.
Who wrote the song?
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King. The speech, the I Have a Dream? No.
I have a dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think when anybody starts to think about those days, and everybody was frightened. I mean, the people who wanted there to be the races free, and people who didn't want them to be that way. They didn't want them mixed. Everybody was
Yeah.
frightened because nobody knew what was going to happen. But I think he made it happen solely by the words of that song.
But that speech is an extraordinary speech, and I actually thought about including that because he does so beautifully pull on all these American icons. He talks about, here he is at in the Lincoln Memorial, right? And he uses the words, free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last, was it just the spiritual, and then I can't remember which song. It's not Star Spangled Banner, but he also references that. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And in this one, you can hear it's so different, right? I mean, there's that fear is very profound. You can hear the binary thinking, you know, Americanism, communism, white, black. It's a world of either and or. And that really, you know, once you can kind of hear that in someone's language, it allows you a way to understand what's going on in their mind. And that's important, I think, certainly as a historian. You know, if you want to understand the ways in which many people approached race. And then also, you know, insofar as it's important to have conversations about these, you know, so that these things can never happen again as well. So there's a historical element and then a political element too. So to me, this habit of mind of trying to move out of yourself empathetically, even if it's a set of ideas that we think of as reprehensible, is really, really a key value of history. And I don't want to claim that it's the sole province of history. Certainly literature does, I think, many of the same things. Anthropology does many of the same things. But it is one of the skills that one learns in history. Yeah?
It seems to me that the imagery that he was sharing in that writing comes almost exactly, or replicates almost exactly D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
And in fact, so when you talk about literature or culture,
yeah.
And in fact, these people were, especially the poor white Southerners, sold a bill of goods that in the division between poor blacks and poor whites, they could have identity. And it seems to me the Birth of a Nation was one good example of where that might have started.
And I think that's not, you're right, that's not coincidental at all, I think. You know, that it represents these sort of deep, each one of those is an expression of its author, but that they represent these deep sort of ways of thinking about it. Yeah, that's fantastic. The next habit of mind is skepticism. And the study of history, I have found, fosters a pretty strong sense of skepticism for official pronouncements. You know, you see this oftentimes, you're reading these glorious speeches about war by presidents and presidential candidates, and then you see the accounts of the soldiers themselves or read about profits that were being made. If you can look at gender history and you can see these accounts by physicians that, you know, women should not run, either if they ran marathons or had too much education, then that would affect their childbearing abilities, which doesn't seem to be true. And you can either, so you read these things and look at history of science and you can either laugh or you can cry, but it does foster this questioning, I think, approach toward these pronouncements. I think history of science is particularly wonderful for this. So I want to show you Samuel George Morton, who was an American doctor and a scientist, and he taught anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania in the first part of the 19th century. And he had studied in Edinburgh, which was the center of the great new science of phrenology. Does anyone know what phrenology is? Yes, the study of the brain and how the bumps on your head showed your intelligence. So he was fascinated by this, and he said, well, I'm going to bring this home to the United States. And he decided he wanted to focus on the relationship between intelligence and race. And so he began collecting skulls, and he collected over 1,000 of them. Some of them were donated. Others, he had his friends would creep out into these cemeteries in the dead of night and dig up these cadavers and bring back the skulls. And you know, it's highly illegal. But Morton noted the race of each skull, and then he lined them up and he very precisely filled them with lead shot, and he measured their capacity or volume. And this is what he found. So here are his division of the 5 races: Caucasian, Mongolian, Malay, American, and Ethiopian. The number of skulls, the mean, the internal capacity in inches of each of those skulls, the largest, and then the smallest. And not surprisingly, he found that whites have a larger cranial capacity, and so it was a very short leap for him to say, well, since white people have a larger cranial capacity, thus they're intellectually superior, and I've just proved it through science. And when he drew on this data in his published papers, here's what he said about Native Americans. He said, they're slow in acquiring knowledge, restless, revengeful, and fond of war. Their mental faculties from infancy to old age present a continued childhood. Of Africans, he said, in disposition, the Negro is joyous, flexible, and indolent. The Negroes have little invention, but strong powers of imitation, so they readily acquire mechanic arts. They have a great talent for music. And the white people? The Caucasian race is distinguished for the facility with which it attains the highest intellectual endowments. And so with this, Morton gave this kind of scientific blessing to what everyone knew already, which was that African Americans and Native Americans were not very bright. They were somewhat childlike, and they had to be taken care of by Caucasians. It was the scientific version of the white man's burden idea. And it was, of course, a very convenient science to have in the years leading up to the Civil War. Now when we look at Morton, we think of him as the father of scientific racism, but he was a very well-respected man in his day. And I think that really gives one pause to think about how much credence he had and what may be out there now that we're sanctioning through science that people will laugh at in 100 years. So there are many examples that one can draw on for thinking about skepticism, but I'll leave the other ones up to you. The last habit of mind I want to talk about is the ability to think from multiple points of view. I see this as the ability to look at a situation and understand that the different actors in the situation are all experiencing their own reality, and that one does not have to validate one of those realities over the others. That you can, but that you have to understand that each person is coming at something from their own perspective. And this becomes really particularly interesting in the telling and writing of history, because you do have to write it from, you have to start it somewhere and you have to stop it somewhere, and there's an implicit narrative there. But you can work against that, and there's a really fabulous book called The Unredeemed Captive, which some of you may know. It's about colonial Deerfield, Massachusetts, and a raid on that. And the author, John Demos, starts his narrative in multiple places, and he really, by doing that, he highlights the fact that there are multiple stories that could be told there. So I want to give you an example that you'll all recognize. Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange from 1936. It's a tremendously moving image, which is why it's been so famous. It invokes the Madonna and Child. Clearly, there's this long visual tradition. And the title that she chose to give it, Migrant Mother, reinforces that. It's not specifically about this person and her name. It's about this idea of motherhood, right? But let's look at the history of the image. Here's the photographer, Dorothea Lange. She had a successful portrait studio in San Francisco. She had been married and a mother herself. She had 2 children who were born in the 1920s. And she divorced her first husband, and in 1935 she married again a professor of economic agricultural history. And they went together and they worked with sharecroppers, and he interviewed and got data, and she photographed. She really saw herself as an outsider. She identified very strongly with the subjects of her photographs. She was divorced. She was a mother who was not with her children, and she, in fact, had a limp that had made her feel like an outsider all along. And she worked with disempowered people all her life. Some of you may know these very famous photographs that she took of Japanese-American children who were about to go to the internment camps, and they're saying the Pledge of Allegiance. And it's a profound juxtaposition. So she really saw herself as an advocate. And here's how she describes the encounter. She said, "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food. There she sat in their lean-to tent with her children huddled around her, and seemed to know that my pictures might help her, and so she helped me. There was a sort of equality about it." So I want to show you the other photographs that Lange took that day. Oops. Oh dear. imagine now this series of this event from the perspective of the subject of the photographs. She's desperately poor. She's trying to feed her children. She's just sold tires for food. And this well-dressed woman drives up in a car with a camera. What do we know about the photograph from her perspective? Well, it turns out we know that her name is Florence Owens Thompson. She was a pea picker. She was 32. She had 7 children at that point. And in the late 1970s, she wrote a letter to a newspaper telling her side of the story. It's very short, but it gives you a sense. She wrote, "I wish that she, Lang, hadn't taken my picture. I can't get a penny out of it. She didn't ask my name. She said she wouldn't sell the pictures. She said she'd send me a copy. She never did." So it's a very different perspective. And we need to keep in mind that both Lang and Thompson are writing years and years later after the photograph had affected both of their lives. And so, you know, their approach to that moment has been shaped then by those intervening years. But you can see how profound that difference is. And there's another point of view on this photograph. Whoops. This, when she took the picture, Lang was employed by the Farm Security Administration, which was one of the New Deal agencies. And this is a man named Roy Stryker, who was in charge of the Farm Security Administration photographers. His job was to send photographers out to capture images of rural poverty during the Depression, and also implicitly to show the need for farm programs to alleviate that poverty. He was very, very interested in photographs that showed what he called dignity versus despair. That was a way that he talked about the photographs. And he put out these photographs through magazines like Life and Look and Fortunes, magazines that reached large numbers of middle-class Americans. He saw his job as very, very important, and looking back, he described it later as "we introduced America to Americans." Of that photograph, he said, "Lang never surpassed it. To me, it was the picture. The others were marvelous, but that was special. She is immortal." And so that's another perspective. And of course, there are other perspectives too. You can imagine being one of the readers of those magazines and seeing that photograph and having, you know, coming at it with that particular history. So to tell the story of that photograph, Migrant Mother, as a historian, you need to recognize that there are all these different perspectives from which to tell it, and different places at which to start. If you were talking from the perspective of the migrant mother, the story might start with the encounter between her and Dorothea Lang. Dorothea Lang's story might start with her inspiration to photograph the people of the Great Depression. And Roy Stryker's story might begin with his hiring at the Farm Security Administration. Many different stories to tell. Each of those is real, each is important. And as a historian, you can see how much richer our understanding of that photograph is when you incorporate them. So that brings me to my final point. I've talked about all these intellectual skills and habits of mind. And the one sort of thread that runs through them, I think, is this sort of quest for a historical truth, whether that's something we can find or can't. Analyzing a document, trying to find out what do we know, what can we know from that. Evaluating sources, seeing how each author's own needs colors his or her narrative. Categorizing, hoping to come up with something useful out of this sort of great mass of facts. Developing a historical imagination so you can get close to understanding what someone else's experience has been. Skepticism, which I think often keeps you from accepting these official narratives as the truth. And then finally, this ability to think from multiple perspectives, realizing that there are many stories to tell. And all of them together raise this question, is there such a thing as historical truth? Can we know, is there something that's knowable? Is everything relative? And as I think about those questions, I want to put that out there, and I hope we can talk about that at the end. I keep on my desk a daguerreotype from the 19th century, and it shows this wonderful 19th century family, a father and a mother and 2 children, and she's got a lace collar, and they're sitting there very solemnly. And you may know about daguerreotype that it's the forerunner of the photograph, and the image is etched onto a silver plate and covered with a mirror. And so when you look at it, you can see, very often you see your own reflection because of the mirror. And I think of that as a real metaphor for history. you can hold that daguerreotype in a way so that pretty much all that you see is your own image reflecting back. And that I see as a metaphor for the fairly irresponsible practice of history that you see sometimes, where people are basically mining the past for useful facts for their present agenda. But you can also hold that daguerreotype in a way so that your own image, it's still there, it's still going to be there, but that it's really diminished, and you can see that family, and you can see their hands and the way they're holding each other, and you can start to imagine what their life is like. And for me, when I think about what do we learn when we learn history, it's that careful attention, that attempt to move into their experience. That's what we learn when we learn about history. Thank you.